It's the interplay of the right and left hemisphere at the same time as the interplay of cortex, the midbrain and the safety systems. So it's really marvelous.
Yeah. Welcome, everyone, to Breaking Bread, the podcast brought to you by Apostolic Christian Counseling and Family Services. Excellent always to have you along. Very happy to bring the second part of our episodes on the left and the right hand brain. As the clinicians here at ACCFS spell out what this looks like as we engage with others, our children, our spouses, our world.
What does it look like to engage with people, both using a left and a right brain model?
There's going to be some that we just naturally click with, and you don't even have to think about it. And then there's others you're going to have to be pretty purposeful. So to ask somebody, hey, tell me about your week, for a left brain person, that's going to be pretty easy to respond to that. Yeah. Whereas, if you ask them, what was exciting from your week? That's going to be a much more difficult question. And so just even thinking about, maybe part of what was difficult in connecting there is that I'm asking questions that are kind of the way that I view the world, and what would it look like to meet them in that space? That would be just a really small, maybe practical thing to think about.
For sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I also think with couples, married couples, is you think about the left brain is understanding and make sense of the dynamics that are happening in the relationship. So there is a need for the cognitive aspect of logically linear. Hey, this is what goes on when I approach my spouse in this way, right? That we get into this pattern or cycle. But then there's also the piece of longings and desires underneath of that that are critical to connect to, which is the right, brain part of attachment and shifting the attachment in a way that leads to a deeper connection. And so I think both of those are important and needed in relationship and attachment.
It's interesting because I think about it. I have a dual role as psychologist and also elder. And so one of the things that happens in the elder's office is when people come to confess, okay? And I'm going to take something like confession, all right? The definition of confession, is over here. The knowledge of what people know I need to confess, X, Y, or Z, is also left hemisphere. The emotion of it, the shame of it, oh crud, I don't want to do this kind of thing. But here's the other thing. When I sit with somebody and we're going to talk about confession, one of the things I do is I go to the scripture. I read James 4:16 and I read 1 John 1:9, and we talk about what the scripture says. And then I say, I want to invite you to confess, but I want to invite you to confess because I know how much confession has meant in my life. Because I have had to, and what I try to do, I don't do this perfectly, but I try to connect. This is a human thing, and the relief that comes in people to connect at that level, and those kind of things. It's an embodiment. It's a relationship. It's something else, and what happens in them is different because there's a relational connection that's happening.
Yeah. Yep.
One thing that comes to mind here, Matt, is again, I'm thinking more through a parenting lens, to know our kids and to know kind of how they operate. And so, for example, I've got a child who's very emotional. And so if I can meet them in that, and I know that if I can help them understand their emotion or even share my emotion or do things that stir emotion and creativity, that's going to be deeply connecting for them. Another one, I need to step into that, but they'll get overwhelmed pretty quickly. So we kind of have to toe in and then toe out. And how I'm going to give that instruction is going to vary based on, now, obviously I don't do this perfectly, but I think just to have that awareness and think about what does it look like to grow connection and to meet them in the predominant, way they view the world and operate, I think can be helpful.
I think that's so good. I've got children like that too, emotional, right brain, and I think my logical exposition is going to be helpful, and it never is.
Yes, exactly.
It's a miss every single time.
Yeah.
Just hearing you both say that, I think I just keep thinking it's the beauty of both. Like, it just goes back to that piece of like, we need both sides for a purpose. It helps in parenting relationships, all things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I've got a question. A model that we've podcasted about, we've talked about, is that how you think gives rise to how you feel, and how you feel gives rise to how you behave. It's a beautiful model. Is that a left brain model, is my question.
Well, I tend to think of it more as a triangle, that it could start with any of those pieces. But I think you're right. If we primarily just start with thinking and then see that as the catalyst that drives everything else, I think that is a predominant left brain model. And it would be wise to say, wait, actually, there's some that they're feeling way before any of the emotion comes, or that their behavior has significant. That's really the catalyst, and depending on the moment, even can be different from individual to individual. So I think that's wise to be thoughtful of, for sure.
Yeah, I would agree with Brian. I know this is maybe an extreme example, but where you're driving and maybe you nearly run into somebody, you are actually reacting, and in the and you feel you're like reacting, and you feel the emotion, but you're not thinking, right? I mean, it's like your emotion is leading the way, and that's the way God designed our brains to work. And so in those situations, we would say, actually, emotions, leading, not.
Yeah, well, speak to that exactly. You walk into a room, you walk into a situation, even before you can process the content, it seems like emotions lead very frequently, even for those of us who are left brain.
And maybe just as a very practical example of this would be, if you're in relationship with somebody and you come into the room and you think they're upset, that's going to kick on that part that's like, oh no, and the emotional, and you're going to be perceiving that. Neuroception picks that up prior to even thinking. And then that is going to really then probably drive your behavior and drive your thinking, and like to slow down and say, wait a second, I think I'm feeling something because I noticed the facial expression, and then we can kind of wind back down and use our left hemisphere to kind of help speak logic and then check in on our assumptions that come before we even realize it.
So slowing down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Probably better to say is that our brain does some kind of perception first, okay? It perceives, and sometimes it's perceiving through a very conscious, logical, or big picture. Sometimes it's emotional, and sometimes it's, if I can't breathe, nothing else matters, okay? So when that happens, that's going to drive also the way that we respond as well.
And we actually teach people, so when they're more emotional or like lower brain is activated, like the ability to ask questions kind of gets that frontal brain back online in order to be able to think through and do more of the logical thinking.
So Kathy, is that then a hint and a help to those that might tend towards right brain or having an emotional experience to engage that left? Is asking questions.
Yeah, I think about it a little bit like with more from like a parenting perspective or with kids, that ability to sometimes have to validate the emotion to help kind of calm that emotion, but also be able to engage in conversation to be able to start some of that like facts and logical thinking place. So it's that need to do both there.
Yeah. It's the interplay of the right and left hemisphere at the same time as the interplay of cortex, the midbrain and the safety systems. So it's really marvelous. Yeah.
It also makes me think, too, that sometimes, I think in the church, but maybe even outside of that we primarily think if I just get the right information, that's going to solve things. Where in many ways, it's like, what does it look like to connect relationally? And that sometimes is actually the catalyst, and the strongest catalyst towards change and feeling like connection and even being able to grow in relationship with the Lord or with others. It's more about relational and experience than information.
I've had that exact experience, and I'm finding out that my left brain isn't enough to bring about the change that I need in my life. Mm-hmm. And it was enough until I had certain things explode in my life.
Sure.
And then I realized that logic and knowledge isn't enough.
That's right.
And now what I'm finding myself is reaching over into this other relational part, this other thinking, okay, I need to read the scriptures in a way that I have not read them before, because facts aren't enough.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think this is a really key part. There are many people, ourselves included, okay, that know all that they're supposed to do, right? The information isn't what's lacking. And the question is how we embody that. That's how we live into it. And that particular thing oftentimes is the harder part than is the I need to know the 5 steps. And so a lot of people, for example, would rather read 10 books on something, listen to 150 podcasts, than call another person in church and say, I need to sit down with you and be vulnerable, okay? And so it's like, give me another 50 podcasts, okay?
I think it's an excellent point, Ted. I think you're absolutely right. The amount of content, left brain content that I can bring in is, but none of them really, really speak to that relational part.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your vulnerability, Matt, too, because I think it speaks to stepping into the relationship also requires us to look at ourselves and what it brings out in us. Meaning, so what I mean by that is, like with a couple, where you have an individual who tends towards left and problem solving, which is needed, right? But there's also a level of discomfort that comes up with the spouse, within the spouse, when their wife or husband is at an emotionally tense place. So part of the building the relationship piece requires me to look inside myself and understand and be aware, what is it that it brings up in me? It's different than the answer, right? That's messy. That's uncomfortable.
And it makes me think, too, one of the things we're doing right now at home is we're doing No Screen November. And so this is part of why I've been working long hours. Stay It's just better to stay at work.
Andy's twitchy.
Exactly. But what it's been really interesting to see our kids is you can tell them don't fight or get along, and they're like, okay, just if I sit in front of a screen and then I avoid each other, I do pretty well, But then you remove that and you have to do life together, and all of a sudden they've got to use the right hemisphere to creatively come up with games and the things that they can do together, and there's a lot more play and laughter, and actually there's been some conflict for sure, but also I think more rich relationship that's been really fun to see, and it's just kind of an experience like that makes me, as it's coming to mind as we're talking about this.
I love it.
Let's do a podcast on play.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Let's do it.
For sure.
Sometime that's coming.
Yes.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, 2 halves make a whole. Thanks so much, all of you, for sharing this. Hopefully to our listeners, you got a sense of the beauty of the brain, the beauty of God, but also that God has so lovingly engaged us, right, through the Scriptures, through the disciplines of Christian living, through relationship, to reach out to us in such a healthy way, both with the left, some things to know, and with the right, relational and emotional. May we go forward and engage people in that same manner.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.